Welcome to the 143rd Annual Royal Ulster Academy Exhibition here in the Ulster Museum. I'm delighted to be joined by Royal Ulster Academician Jennifer Trouton. Jennifer, it's lovely to have you here.
Thank you for asking me.
An absolute pleasure, and we're here beside your work. I'm not even going to attempt to try and pronounce it correctly. So how do you pronounce this piece?
I probably will stumble too, and I have checked on Google many times, but I think it's an Italian person who says it, which doesn't make it easier. But in my understanding, it's Latae Sententiae.
And what does that mean?
It's Latin, obviously, and it is the name of a excommunication. It's a form of punishment in the Catholic Church. There's like a two-tiered system of excommunication, and this one is the most extreme, and it's usually reserved for abuse against the Church, but also for women who've had abortion. So it's a form of judgment and being excommunicated.
And just on reflection, and particularly after seeing your body of work in the RUA recently, in plain sight, I was completely overwhelmed by the body of evidence that you have gathered up over the years. This publication, which is part of, I suppose, that evolving body of evidence, and what seemed to me initially work that looked very, very pretty and sensitive, and the reflections of domestic serenity almost. There were underbellies and undercurrents of shame, of references about female rights and reproduction, you know, the whole reproductive system. And I found that fascinating. I found it actually a very, very moving experience to have, first of all, so much work in two of the largest chambers in the RUA is no mean feat. I mean, how long it takes, I have no idea. We were sitting beside just an example of some of your work. The detail and just the serenity when you look at it first. But there's something about the silence that invites you in, and you quite like that idea. You like the idea of the stillness speaking.
Well, that was a very conscious decision from very early days. I mean, I've been making this body work for just short of 8 years. And I think you and I had a conversation yesterday, and I was telling you how this is not work that I set out to make. It's not, I woke up one day with an intention to make it. I had my son in 2014, and I was just making tentative steps back into the studio after maternity leave. And at the same time, my husband had started a PhD on the provision of abortion in Northern Ireland, 1921 to 1969, which is when the UK Abortion Act came into place, but it didn't extend to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland said that it was an exceptional case, that the women here had no appetite for it, there was no need for it. So my husband kind of set out to make this survey PhD to show that wherever there are women, wherever there are men, there will be unwanted pregnancies and there will be a need for abortion. And Northern Ireland was no different in that respect. So he was doing that PhD, I had just had my son, I was tentatively back in the studio making work, which I thought was about motherhood. I thought I would look at this idea of motherhood and also Mother Ireland and how Ireland had appropriated this idea of motherhood. But within like a year, my husband was coming home and he had access to the court cases. These are closed cases. A lot redacted and still closed, not for public consumption.
Yes.
So he was coming home, and naturally, it was traumatizing for him because he was reading stories of very, very traumatic events, women who were dying, whose children were finding them, ended up in the courts, etc. And he was coming home and telling me their stories as a form of therapy for him as well. But I always knew that I wanted to make work that was very inviting, that in many ways spoke to this idea of the Irish home being a place of comfort and familiarity, but really it's a very dangerous place for women. More often than not, women had their abortions in their home and they died in the home, and even today the home is still considered a very violent place for women. They often are killed in their own homes. So I wanted to invite my audience in. I wanted it to be inviting because obviously to shout and scream is not helping the cause. And also because it's a very sensitive issue as well. So I wanted to approach it sensitively. So I did deliberately pick a colour palette that was very nostalgic, that was very alluring. And I made the large-scale installation, one of many, feel very familiar, like you were walking into your grandmother's front room. And then people go up to objects and they'll go, oh, that little enamel bowl, my grandmother had that. But that's okay, because I'm peddling that nostalgia. I want you to think that way. But
and a safe environment as well.
A safe environment.
That's familiar, and actually this idea about the home place being a place of sanctuary, and actually not the case.
Yeah. And that women actually had to use the things around them in the home as their weapons. That's why the show in RHA was called In Plain Sight, because the women literally used the things around them to try and control their bodies or end their pregnancies. So those things are hidden within the work. I mean, they look like to the casual viewer just still lives, but really when you get up closer, there are little clues, and it is like a game of Cluedo in a way. The more you look at it, the more you see. And then once you see, you can't unsee. You actually then go on and look for more clues. The wallpaper that I use throughout the work is William Morris, chosen very specifically for its floral and its kind of fruit motifs, because they're classical references to genitalia and fecundity. But within them I've hand painted little, I mean all the wallpapers are hand painted too, but within them I've embedded religious imagery, mostly of female patron saints. Saints to do with motherhood, childbirth, midwives, marriage, abuse, etc. Once you see one, you go looking for the others, but it might take you 3 or 4 to see it. So it's that idea of slowly revealing itself. There's a lot of layers within the work, because it's not a black and white subject, and it's a very sensitive subject, so I wanted to handle it in such a way that people were drawn into it, and they either chose to engage with it or they chose not to. I was never going to scream at them. It was always going to be like a gentle whisper as such.
And also the silence is almost more deafening than the noise, because when you think of, you know, the context of women and women's health and choices, particularly now when you look at a lot of crimes against women as well, this idea of, you know, the silent scream inside, you know, what struck me as well was that you're in this home that could be anyone's home, our grandmothers, our aunts, you know, even our mothers, and yet there was something quite sinister in the silence. And it was only when I did start to read and look into, you know, what you were telling us, the toxicity of the cocktails that could be made from nature, that Mother Nature could play her part in this, and that dilemma, and also this idea of, you know, good old warm Mother Ireland and the support of all that. I found it actually very, very, very sad, very arresting, and very, very moving. And then when I started to read, because initially I did think this was a catalogue to accompany the body of work, and it's much, much more. I mean, you mentioned it took you 4 years to work on this.
We've been slowly building on it for 4 years. The idea came out around the time it was in lockdown actually. My first show of this work was in 2021 in Galway, and then Belfast in the Naughton Gallery. And one of the things, because I didn't have an opening for those because it was lockdown, people were emailing me or sending me little, kind of social media messages, and women would be saying, oh, I went in with my daughter, or I went in with my mother, and you know, we had a conversation I never thought we would have, or you know, I'm really glad that I had this opportunity to have this moment with my mother or my daughter, etc. And me and my husband at the time both thought, what we'd really like to do is for this exhibition or this body of work to go beyond the gallery, because these women's voices and experiences are locked in archives. They're closed records. So I thought, well, we need to make this conversation go beyond the galleries. So if we can have if someone can go to the gallery and have a conversation, and then that conversation goes beyond it, because one of the things that's silence is, you said, is one of
It is the killer.
It's the killer, because in that silence breeds shame and stigma, and that's what stops women from talking. We live in silence, so we wanted to. I'm going to get upset now, but we wanted to break the silence.
Yes, and irrespective of the scale of the work, the intimacy is very, very prevalent. And I remember hearing someone talk about the definition of intimacy is into me see. You know, this idea about looking in and looking through and looking beyond. And I suppose it brings me back to, you know, when you look at the role of the artist, you have said to me before that this isn't about me, this is about, you know, about women. So you are the conduit, you are providing access, if you like, to something that's really, really invaluable. And those words matter, you know, they really, really do.
I mean, I would genuinely happily not put myself out and do the likes of this or the talks that I've done. I mean, I like the work to go out first, and the work has gone out before me, but I do this because I think it's important to talk about the subject for, you know, the conversations to start. So I do have to slightly put myself forward, but I often say it's not about me as much as it's about the subject and about the women who the work speaks for or speaks to. That's what's important to me, and I'm still making work around this subject. I haven't drawn a line under this because I've been asked a few times, and I actually find it a little bit odd question. So what next? What are you doing next? And I'm like, do people ask Sean Skull Kelly.
I know.
What does anybody ask Colin Davison when he's going to stop doing those?
Yes.
Doing his, it's like, this is actually a very important subject, and there's so much imagery, and there's so much. I have lots more ideas that I want to explore. So until the ideas stop coming, or even if I feel I've said enough, but there's so many women and so many stories and so much buried history. The thing about women's history is it is invisible. Like, I have a piece in the show called The Invisible Past.
And there was something that you mentioned as well about you can't unsee. You know, you can't unsee or unlearn. We're often products of our upbringing, of the schools that we've gone to, you know, the experience that we've had. And our lived experience, individual and collective, is very precious. It is important as well. You know, in the media and materials and processes that you use, Jennifer, you're quite prolific in what you use and how you create your pieces. The pieces that you, well, this particular piece here, what did you use?
Well, the wallpaper, the background that's actually a print, but that is a wallpaper, a hand painted wallpaper that I painted. It's been reproduced.
Yes,
and
but
it's my design, and it's hand painted. I've just reduced it down and printed it to that scale to paint over the top of it. I mean, I probably am mostly considered a painter, and I do work a good 90% of the time within paint. But this body of work has definitely stretched me out beyond the paint, and it's more expanded in my practice, and that I brought in a lot more objects, a lot more artifacts. I've done embroidery, I've even done watercolour.
That's right.
And these are things that would also be seen as women's mediums and women's crafts.
And pretty little things.
Pretty little things. Like, I did a whole series of embroideries, and I did them during lockdown. And I didn't set out to do them because I was just trying to still the mind and keep the hand busy to fight off the absolute...
Something, that phrase, still the mind.
And busy,
keep the hand busy.
That's
very powerful, even that phrase.
I would say that sums up my life. I'm not very good when I don't have my mind, you know, busy and my hands busy. So yeah, I find that lockdown was a very difficult time for me on many levels. We were actually living in China at the time of the pandemic, and we ended up coming back here for a personal reason and got locked here. Our life was actually back in China, our home was back in China, but we were locked back in Ireland, and my son had no schooling then, and he, you know, it was awful. I had to start homeschooling him,
and
he was only 5, so it was P1, and I had to do all the. And I find it a very difficult time, and I've always been very productive. Like, I have my husband, between my husband and a colleague of mine, they came up with this fantastic expression of what my practice is, which is tectonically productive, in that I am very productive because I do put a lot of hours in. I'm very daily kind of interaction. My discipline's very important because of the way I work. You can't set it down and pick it up, but I work still so slowly. So even though I'm productive, I'm tectonically, and that is just slow, tip. And even since my show in RHA, I've struggled to take time off. I'm back in the studio working.
I wondered.
I know. Yeah. But so lockdown was very difficult for me. I had nothing to do. I was actually living with my mother. Out in our, where you and me were both raised. I ended up back with my mother. So I picked up the embroidery, which I'd done a little bit of in China. And I thought I was done with, one and done. I thought, I'm not doing that again. That's a difficult thing.
But you always had an awareness of the tapestries, of the wallpaper, and there was something that I think a textile artist would be drawn to your work because of that.
I think I've always been interested in the domestic space. It's run throughout my whole work. And the materials of the domestic space, the wallpapers, the fabrics, have always been a draw to me, always been an attraction to me. And I have woven them in, excuse the pun, into my practice throughout the years. And it's very much come to the fore in this large body of work. There's a lot of textiles, there's a lot of wallpapers, so those things really do genuinely interest me. I never thought I'd start designing my own wallpaper or doing my own embroidery. In many ways I've painted them, but now I've taken them out of the paint, like where I've designed my own, got them made, got them photographed, and now I'm painting my own design fabrics. So it's kind of come beyond. It's gone beyond just the surface.
And are you doing that commercially?
No, just within the practice.
Right. Okay.
So I designed that wallpaper, painted it within a big painting, had it professionally photographed, turned it into an actual wallpaper, which some of the work in the RHA is hung on that wallpaper. And then I turned it into a silk and a cotton fabric, and then I put it back into two of the paintings. So the fabric's also in two of the paintings. So so there's a lot of layering within the work, and there's a lot of motifs that follow through the work. And that's, you know, formally in terms of like aesthetics, really helps bring the work together visually. But it's also about the cyclical nature and of the home and ritual and routine and make, do and mend as well. So like that pattern exists in both the galleries. It exists as both a wallpaper, as a fabric. It's within a painting as well. So it's also helping to reinforce the language and the theme as well. So, but this show, there is definitely more materiality in it. I have embroidery in it. And
mixed media.
Mixed media. Well, yeah, I have a little bit of mixed media, and I have a lot of artifacts in it as well. Because at one point I realised I was surrounded my studio. I mean, a lot of them are familial, a lot of them are my grandmother's, but then I also sourced a lot of images like vintage Lysol, which is like a disinfectant, and an original Higginson syringe, which ladies would have, washed themselves out with. And they were all surrounding me in my studio, and there is something much more visceral and potent about an object than a painting, because a painting is like one step removed from reality.
That's right.
It's not
360.
It's not 360, and it's also, it loses some of its strength in that respect. So I was looking at those objects and I went, God, it'd be really nice to introduce them as well. So that's when I started making those circular shelves, where they then designed little wallpapers that were hand painted onto the shelves.
They're beautiful.
That reinforced the narrative.
Yeah.
Like the little boat had a wallpaper that had the routes for the boats that would have gone back and forth to like Scotland and Liverpool. So I designed wallpapers to reinforce the narrative of the object. So that kind of came out organically, and that's the beauty of having that daily engagement with your own practice and being in the studio every day and slowly working through ideas, and you always carry something of your previous piece with you into the next. And by having that, like I say, really productive relationship with my studio, that those things come out naturally. They're not forced. I'm not sitting at home trying to pull out an idea. The idea comes with me being in the studio and making, like just being surrounded by those objects.
Jennifer, you have a lot more to do, in terms of the stories that you're telling, because I've no doubt that in preparation for the body of work and evidence that you've already gathered, that then the responses to that body of evidence has now become
a part of it.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so, and it's been overwhelming.
How do you manage that?
I actually quite enjoy it with this body of work. These are just people who literally sometimes just want to say thank you, or just to say they enjoyed it.
And also that you've reached them.
You've actually reached them. I mean, they don't ask. I mean, I occasionally get asked a technical question about my practice, and I'll be like, but I do answer every single person who reaches out to speak to me. No, but I like it because that's what this whole body of work was about. It was about breaking the silence. It was about conversation. It was about bringing women's voices out of the archives into the public spaces and beyond, and hopefully then that will lessen the silence. So those women contacting me is the start of it.
And distilling the dialogue as well, which is very, very important, because the conversations are not just between you and the person confiding in you, it's actually becoming much more apparent. Is there at any stage, do you think, that artists in particular have to protect themselves for receiving comments about their work when it's out there in the ether? And what I mean by that is that art is meant to move and inspire, and it can do, but sometimes we're never quite prepared for what someone's going to, or how they're going to respond.
Oh, absolutely.
Have you felt that, or have you experienced that?
Oh, absolutely. And you can absolutely choose to respond or not respond. You can shut it down. But the response to this work has been overwhelmingly positive.
It was about the level of detail, the level of reverence, and the significance of what you'd created in a way that I had never really seen before.
I did get
consistency.
And I've been asked quite a few times though about why didn't I farm out the likes of the embroidery and stuff like that. And I was like, well, actually, no, it's really important to me because it's almost paying respect to women's labour.
Yes.
To farm it out would be to belittle the process.
And perpetuate what it is that you're trying to...
Yeah, the idea. So I was very conscious that I would do it all. I did all the embroideries, I did everything. And yeah, I did. I mean, the thing about what that body work is, as you said, there are very small pieces and very big bits.
Yes.
And the small, but I brought that installation together so that it felt like a singular piece, and it was built up as small and big. It's that intimacy, but when you put it together, it has a punch. And I think Christine Leach in her essay made a beautiful point about the punches in the beauty as well.
Yes,
and
that's exactly it.
It is. It's like the sting is in the beauty and in the intimacy, and I mean, to do, I mean, I know there's a big diptych that is quite large, and it's a big still life, and I deliberately made it large because still life.
Making a statement?
I'm making a statement because still life would not have been large, because it would have been the purview of women. Those botanical paintings would not have been large; they would have been the purview of women.
Because
again.
that was a tradition that women painted pretty pictures, and
they wouldn't have had studios either. They'd been working from their domestic space as well, so they would have been limited by their domestic confines as well. So I did that diptych humongously big, like 6 foot by 5 foot diptych, so that's 10 by 10. Well,
I found that
can't
amazing.
do the maths there, 12 by 10, because I wanted it to be almost like a dig at the museum style, large masculine pieces of work. You know, you go to all these national galleries and they're big paintings, but they're all male paintings.
That's
they're not done by women. They're done. Okay, there are exceptions to every rule, and you have Artemisia and stuff, but really in the majority of cases it's men. So I did that deliberately. I went, okay, I'm doing still life, I'm doing pretty flowers, I'm doing botanicals, but I'm doing them subversively.
And you know, when you look at the toxicity of the subject matter in terms of the flora and fauna that you were referencing to, and the potential of that. And I suppose I was curious to know, how long did it take to do that triptych? How long?
That diptych took 3 years from beginning to end. They were on the easel for 3 years, and I worked pretty much exclusively on them. I might have been doing embroideries in the evening, or maybe working on a smaller piece in between when you take a natural break, because sometimes you got to take a week to dry or whatever. But really it was pretty much 3 years. Like, I'm very aware it took nearly 8 years to make this body work, and those first 5 years I just had my son, and I think people must have thought I fell off a cliff. Like, where did she go? Because I was pretty much just making for 5 years, and I was inviting people in to see it, and the reception wasn't necessarily the most positive, only because of the subject matter.
Yes, and you were telling me that has changed now.
That has changed. I mean, I'm quite shocked to see how that changed, and maybe it's because it's no longer illegal.
The way that you have chosen to create it and represent it has been done in a very dignified, solemn, beautiful, engaging way.
That's right.
You know, because sometimes we are, you know, when you think of people screaming and shouting and, you know, the goriness of it all, it can actually really stop you in your tracks, and you get the opposite, where there's almost like a dignified sympathy. You know, maybe more empathy is a better choice. Empathy is better than sympathy, but just very, very powerful. And I think, Jennifer, you've underestimated the impact that you've made, not only on the art world, but also in raising women's voices.
Well, that to me is the most important bit. I mean, obviously it's my career, my job, and yes, I always, you know, it's always nice to know that the curators liked it, or you get an invitation to show somewhere else. But for me, it was always about the voices. Like, who else? Who spends 3 years making a single piece of work? It is financial suicide in some respects. And 8 years making a single body of work. But I never thought about it in terms of my career. I just thought, like I said, there's no memorial, there's no plaque, there's no museum. No one talks about it. No one speaks about it, and no one talks about it in a way that's about remembering, instead of like screaming and shouting, change the laws, you know, my body, my rules. It was more about remembering the women who died. It was so poignant for me because I'd just become a mother. And so many of the women who died in their homes were found by their children. There's a lot of children's toys and a lot of motifs run through the work. I noticed that. And that's to remind people that it wasn't the so-called fallen Jezebels that got pregnant. It was women who had financial hardship, whose marriages were struggling, who had health implications, who were socially disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, who wanted to not have their 6th, 7th, even their 3rd or 4th pregnancy. And more often than not, those children were in the next room when it was happening. And then later on that day, they'd find their mother had died from an embolism or something else. So having become a mother, it just became, I mean, yes, I had the experience myself when I was younger, and I had never spoken about it, and it was my shame and stigma too. But I think becoming a mother was my biggest drive behind it as well. It was like, no, those kids found their mums dead. And
very, very serious and challenging subject matter to deal with, and to deal with it so courageously. This publication is available to buy.
Yes, it is. And 70% of the proceeds go to abortion services. So we don't keep any of the, we only keep, I basically get the postage back.
Yes.
70% of the sales go to abortion services charity, and it's currently available on my website. There's a link there to purchase it. I mean, hopefully it'll be available in other places too.
Yes.
And it's still available at the RHA if people are down at the RHA.
I mean, it's a beautiful publication, beautifully presented.
Thank you.
And also, I love the fact that you have included, beautiful illustrations of your work. I mean, you must have the patience of a saint.
It's a new skill. It was a new skill. I mean, I worked with a very talented designer, Alex.
Because you worked on this for how many?
On the book? Well, I mean, it took us 4 years to get it over the line, but unbelievably, the design work took place in 5 weeks.
Okay.
And it was, the 12th of July was actually the date for it to go to, it was actually printed in Venice. And the 12th of July, believe it or not, was the date to go to Venice. And I worked with a very talented designer, but at the same time, it's my layout. It's the choice of images, the choice of layout, all of that's me. I just worked with him to help facilitate it. But it was a whole new skill that I learned, and it was hard work and it was stressful.
And do you think, I mean, the role of the artist and then the role of the curator, but having the autonomy?
Oh, yes.
As an artist, I think it's very important to see from, concept right through to, your vision, and then right through then to the, making that vision a possibility. It's very important.
My husband likes to call me a control enthusiast, which is very true. I mean, there is a place in this world for curators, and they are wonderful, but I do tend to like to have a lot of control in that respect.
Yes.
I mean, so I had complete autonomy with the design of the book, and even with the RHA show, I had complete autonomy with the hang. I had many meetings with my curator, and she was wonderful, but she never once did. She was like,
leave you to it.
You know what you're doing. And that was brilliant.
And there's a great confidence with that.
Yeah.
And huge congratulations, Jennifer, for the work that you've done, and continued success.
Oh, thank you.
In telling the story of many. I have a funny feeling that the responses to this and your work will continue to.
I hope so. I hope the work gets seen again and more conversations are had.